It was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. The sun was shining, the guests were laughing, and everything seemed perfect. But beneath the surface, there was a tension I couldn't shake. Something gnawed at me, a feeling I hadn't been able to put into words until that exact moment. I had stepped outside to get some fresh air during the reception. The garden was quiet, far removed from the music and celebration. I needed a break from the overwhelming joy and the sense of responsibility settling in now that Melanie and I were officially husband and wife. We had been through so much to reach this point: the planning, the stress, the arguments. Marriage was supposed to be a new beginning, but something felt wrong. As I turned the corner of the garden, I saw them. There, standing beneath the oak tree, was Melanie. She was talking to David, our gardener. That alone wasn't unusual. He'd worked for us for nearly a year, maintaining the grounds. But it was the way they stood together that made my heart skip a beat. They were close, too close. Melanie's hand rested on his arm, and she was laughing. I froze, rooted to the spot, my mind trying to process what I was seeing. Then, it happened. She leaned in, and for a fleeting second, they hugged. It was brief, almost innocent, but it was enough to send a jolt through my entire body. I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, unable to move, unable to speak. I didn't know what to think. Had I really just seen that? My wife, the woman I had just promised to spend the rest of my life with, hugged another man? I wanted to storm over there, to confront them, but I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I backed away, retreating into the shadows of the house, my mind racing. I told myself it must have been nothing, a moment of wedding day excitement, a misunderstanding. Maybe I was just being paranoid, overwhelmed by the stress of the day. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. That night, as we danced and celebrated with our guests, I watched them closely. Melanie seemed distant, her smiles forced, her attention elsewhere. And David, well, he disappeared after that moment in the garden, probably to avoid being seen. I couldn't shake the image of them together, the way she looked at him. It was a look I hadn't seen in a long time, a look of desire, of longing. And it wasn't for me. The days after the wedding were a blur. We went on our honeymoon, but the feeling lingered. Melanie was distracted, constantly checking her phone, her laughter no longer genuine. When I tried to talk to her, she brushed me off, claiming she was just tired from all the wedding stress. But it wasn't just that. Something had changed between us, and I could feel it. I started noticing little things that seemed insignificant at first but added up. She began disappearing for hours at a time, with vague explanations about meeting friends or running errands. When I asked about her day, her answers were brief, as if she didn't want to talk to me. The warmth between us, the connection we once had, was gone. In its place was a growing sense of distance, like she was shutting me out. The more I thought about it, the more I became convinced that something was going on between her and David. I remembered the way they had looked at each other on our wedding day, the way their bodies had naturally gravitated toward one another. Was it possible that their relationship had started before we even said our vows? The thought made my stomach turn. I tried to brush it off, to focus on work and push the doubts aside. But the more I tried, the more the suspicion grew. Melanie's behavior became stranger by the day. She seemed more comfortable talking to David than she did with me. Whenever he was around, her face lit up, and she was quick to find reasons to be in the garden, even though she never showed much interest in it before. One day, I found them talking again, this time by the rose bushes. They were standing close, their conversation quiet. She laughed, her hand playfully touching his shoulder, and I could feel the blood rushing to my head. It was happening again, right in front of me. My chest tightened with rage, but I forced myself to walk away. Confronting her then, and there wouldn't solve anything. I needed to know the truth, and I needed proof. That night, as Melanie slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. Was I imagining it? Was I just being insecure? But the hug I had seen, the way she acted around him, it was too real to ignore. I couldn't let it go. The next day, I decided to take action. I hired a private investigator, someone who could follow them without being noticed, someone who could get me the evidence I needed. If my wife was betraying me, I wasn't going to let it slide. I needed to know how deep this went, how long it had been going on. The investigator wasted no time. Within a week, I received the first set of photos. They were blurry, taken from a distance, but they were unmistakable. There they were, walking side by side in the park, their hands brushing against each other, smiles on their faces. There was something so casual about it, as if they had done this 100 times before. And then, the next photo, another hugged, this one longer. My heart sank as I stared at the pictures, each one confirming what I had feared all along. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't just a one-time thing. Melanie was cheating on me with David, and it had likely been going on for a long time. I closed the envelope and sat there in silence, the weight of the betrayal settling on my shoulders. I thought back to our wedding day, to the moment I had seen them in the garden. I had known then, deep down, that something was wrong, but I had ignored it, hoping it would go away. Now, there was no denying it. After that first set of photos, I couldn't look at Melanie the same way anymore. Every time she walked into the room, I wondered what kind of lies she was preparing to feed me next. My heart was heavy with the weight of her betrayal, but I couldn't let her know that I was onto her. Not yet. I needed more evidence, more clarity. Something inside me demanded to know how deep this deception ran. Days turned into weeks, and I kept pretending everything was fine, pretending that I didn't notice how she was slowly drifting further away from me. Her behavior became more erratic, disappearing for hours without any real explanation, taking longer and longer shopping trips, and brushing me off with vague excuses. I would sit there, watching her, wondering where she really went and with whom. She seemed happy when she left, often wearing that same smile I had seen in the photos with David. But when she returned home, she was distant, barely engaging with me at all. It was as if I had become invisible to her, just a shadow in her life that she had to tolerate. The arguments between us escalated. We fought over the smallest things: what to have for dinner, how I folded the laundry, the time I spent at work. She constantly accused me of not paying enough attention to her, of being more focused on my job than on her needs. I tried to explain that I was working to provide the life she always wanted, but nothing I said seemed to matter. "It's not about the money," she would say, her voice cold and detached. "It's about you not being here." I didn't understand what she wanted. I was trying to make things work, to keep our life together stable. But no matter how hard I tried, it was never enough. The truth was, Melanie wasn't interested in me anymore. I was just a part of the house, a part of her life that she no longer cared for. Her attention, her affection, her love, they were all directed towards someone else. David. He was always there, lurking in the background. Every time I saw him working in the garden, I could feel the tension between us. He didn't know I had already discovered his affair with my wife, and I intended to keep it that way. He continued to go about his business as if nothing was wrong, but I could see the way he glanced at Melanie when he thought no one was watching. The looks they exchanged were filled with secrets that they thought I was too blind to notice. One evening, after another one of her unexplained absences, Melanie came home with shopping bags full of expensive items. A new pair of shoes, a designer handbag, things she would normally never spend money on without consulting me first. I asked her about it, trying to sound casual, but the defensiveness in her response told me all I needed to know. "I can spend my own money how I want, can't I?" she snapped, her tone sharper than usual. "It's not your money, Melanie," I reminded her, trying to keep my frustration in check. "We both know where the money comes from." She rolled her eyes and walked away, leaving me standing there. I knew then that the money wasn't for her. It was for him. She was using my hard-earned income to spoil David, to buy him gifts. The thought made my blood boil, but I kept my rage hidden. There would be a time for that later. In the following days, I noticed more and more things going missing from our house. Small items at first, nothing major. Watches, jewelry, even cash that I had left on the kitchen counter. Each time I asked about it, Melanie would shrug and act like it wasn't a big deal. But it was a big deal. She was spending our money, giving away our possessions, and I had no doubt they were all going to him. My private investigator continued sending me reports. Each one was worse than the last. Photos of them walking together in the park, their bodies close, their hands intertwined like a couple in love. Pictures of them sitting at a cafe, lost in conversation, as if the rest of the world didn't exist. And then, the hotel photos, those were the worst. Seeing them enter the same hotel, again and again, tore me apart. The hotel bills were charged to our joint credit card. Melanie didn't even bother to hide the fact that she was using my money to fund her affair. She booked the rooms, paid for the meals, all while I was left in the dark, or at least that's what she thought. The shadows around us grew darker, thicker, suffocating me with each passing day. I could barely function at work anymore. Every time the phone rang, I half expected it to be another update from the investigator, another picture of them wrapped in each other's arms. One evening, as I was going through my emails, I saw a notification from the bank, a new purchase. A car, brand new, bought from a high-end dealership. I didn't recognize the car model or the amount, but I knew exactly who it was for. David. She had bought him a car, with my money. That was the breaking point. I had to know everything, every last detail of how far this had gone. The shadows of their affair had stretched long enough. I wasn't going to sit idly by and let them keep trampling over my life. I called the private investigator again. This time, I wanted more than just photos. I needed to catch them in the act, and I needed it to happen soon. I thought I was prepared for what the investigator would uncover next, but nothing could have braced me for the depth of Melanie's betrayal. The next set of photos came with a detailed report. I remember staring at them, my hands trembling. It wasn't just a few casual meetings or secret glances anymore. They had crossed into a full-blown affair, one that had been happening long before I even had an inkling of it. The investigator's report laid it all out. Melanie and David had been meeting for months, sneaking around behind my back while I worked tirelessly to support her every whim. The worst part? Their relationship didn't start after we got married. It had been going on even before we said our vows. It wasn't just a betrayal of our marriage. It was a betrayal of the entire foundation of our relationship. She walked down the aisle knowing she was lying to me. David wasn't just some harmless flirtation. He had a criminal past, something I had learned only recently, and Melanie knew about it. It didn't bother her, no. It seemed like it thrilled her. The investigator dug deeper and found details about David's past, petty theft, and a few run-ins with the law that were far more serious. Yet here she was, drawn to him like a moth to a flame, while I was left picking up the pieces of my shattered trust. I couldn't understand it. What had I done wrong? I had given Melanie everything, my time, my love, my loyalty. I worked long hours because I thought that's what she wanted. We'd had arguments, sure, mostly about the usual things. She would complain that I wasn't around enough, that I wasn't paying enough attention to her. I always assumed those fights were just part of the natural strain that comes with balancing work and a relationship. But now, it was all starting to make sense. While I was working to build a life for us, she was finding her satisfaction elsewhere. There was one day I'll never forget, the day everything started to unravel. I had just returned home early from work. Melanie wasn't expecting me. As I walked into the house, I could hear voices coming from the garden. Her voice, light and full of laughter, and his deep, with a tone that sent a wave of anger through me. I approached the window, peeking through the blinds to see them sitting on the patio, close, their hands brushing as they talked. I felt like an intruder in my own home. She leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder like it was the most natural thing in the world. The sight was too much to bear. My throat tightened, and my heart raced as I watched her smile at him, that smile, the one I hadn't seen directed at me in months. The way she looked at him was the way I had always wanted her to look at me. In that moment, I realized something terrible. I was no longer her husband in her eyes. I was nothing more than a shadow, a financial provider, while David was the one who made her feel alive. I could see it clearly now. Melanie wasn't just having an affair. She was in love with him. I tried to recall the last time she looked at me like that, like I was her everything, but the memory was faint, almost non-existent. Maybe it had never really existed at all. The investigator's photos confirmed what I had seen with my own eyes. They were a couple in every sense of the word, meeting regularly at the same park, walking hand in hand, and kissing like it was the most natural thing in the world. They checked into hotels under fake names, using our joint bank account to cover the expenses. She was using my money to fund her fantasy life with him. The thought of it made me sick. I kept hoping I would wake up from this nightmare, that I'd discover it was all a terrible misunderstanding. But every day, more and more evidence piled up, suffocating any hope I had left. The receipts from the high-end stores started to make sense. The clothes, the gifts, the car she bought for him, she spared no expense. While I had been under the impression that I was working to make our dreams come true, she was busy spending our savings on another man. What burned me the most was how she never hesitated to use my hard-earned money to pamper him. She bought David expensive watches, designer clothes, and, most outrageously, a new car fresh from the dealership, all with my money. The investigator had traced every purchase back to Melanie, each one a slap in the face, a reminder that she didn't care about me or our future together. The life I thought we were building was nothing but a facade. And yet, she continued to come home each night as if everything was normal, acting like I didn't notice the growing distance between us. I'd ask her about her day, and she'd give me vague answers, offering no details. It was like she had put up a wall, and I was on the other side, desperately trying to find a way in. There were more confrontations between us, each one more bitter than the last. I'd try to talk to her, to figure out where we had gone wrong, but she always shifted the blame onto me. "You're never around," she'd say. "You're more focused on your work than on me." But that was the cruel irony. I was working to make her happy, to give her everything she ever wanted. One night, after another heated argument, I decided to confront her more directly. I showed her one of the photos from the investigator's report, her and David walking in the park, hand in hand. She didn't deny it. In fact, she didn't even look surprised. "I didn't mean for you to find out like this," she said quietly, her eyes avoiding mine. There was no remorse, no apology, just a resigned acceptance, like she had been expecting this moment for a long time. "You didn't mean for me to find out?" I repeated, my voice shaking with a mix of rage and disbelief. "That's it? That's all you have to say?" She just stood there, silent, staring at the floor. In that moment, I realized that the woman I had married was gone. Maybe she had been gone for a long time, and I just hadn't seen it. The betrayal ran deeper than I ever thought possible. She had destroyed not only our marriage, but the very foundation of trust we had built over the years. Now, all that was left was the cold, hard truth. My wife was in love with another man, and I was nothing more than an obstacle in her way. She had given up pretending, and in that cold, emotionless silence, I realized there was no going back. My suspicions, the moments of doubt and confusion, they had all been confirmed. It was time to face the truth, no matter how ugly it was. But I wasn't done. There was more to uncover, more lies to strip away. Melanie's betrayal had left me angry, hurt, and humiliated, but also strangely focused. I needed to understand how deep her deceit went. How long had she been living this double life? And how far was she willing to go to protect it? I had more questions than answers, and I wasn't ready to confront her again without knowing everything. That's when I decided to dive deeper. If she wasn't going to tell me the truth, I'd have to find it myself. The private investigator had given me enough information to start connecting the dots. There were still holes in the timeline, gaps that didn't make sense. I started by looking through our bank statements, searching for more purchases and payments that didn't add up. That's when I noticed something I had missed before. There were frequent, large cash withdrawals over the past 6 months. Thousands of dollars, unaccounted for. I had assumed they were for household expenses or maybe gifts for family, but now I knew better. She was funneling money to David, giving him cash to keep his lifestyle afloat. I felt sick. Not only was she cheating on me, but she was using me as her personal ATM to fund their affair. I could picture it now, her handing over the money with a smile, knowing full well that it was coming from our shared account. Money I had earned through long hours of hard work. Then there were the text messages. Most of the time, there was nothing unusual in her texts or calls. It was as if she knew I might be watching. But one night, while she was in the shower, I finally caught a glimpse of the other phone, the one she hid so well. It was in her bag, tucked deep into a hidden pocket. My heart raced as I grabbed it, unlocking it with the code I had figured out months ago. This was her real phone, the one she used to communicate with David. The messages were there, pages and pages of them, filled with things I didn't want to read but had to. They didn't hold back. There were sweet nothings, plans for secret meetups, and conversations about how they couldn't wait to see each other again. It wasn't just physical between them, it was emotional. They shared their deepest thoughts, talked about their future, discussed me like I was some distant, irrelevant obstacle in their path. Melanie referred to me as the banker, someone who was there to provide money but nothing more. What hurt the most were the messages about the wedding. They laughed about it, how she had managed to fool everyone, including me. David had even attended the ceremony, standing quietly in the background while we exchanged vows, knowing full well that they had been together all along. It was a cruel joke, one that they had both played on me while I stood there, thinking I was the luckiest man in the world. I remember sitting there, holding her phone in my hands, trembling with anger. I had been nothing but a means to an end for her, a way to get the life she wanted, while secretly giving her heart to another man. The lies were so deep, so intricately woven, that I couldn't see the truth until it was right in front of me, staring back at me from the screen of her hidden phone. But there was more. I wasn't prepared for what I found next. Among the messages, there were photos of them together, not just in hotels or parks, but in places I had never seen before. Expensive restaurants, private getaways, places she had told me she had visited with friends or on business trips. It was all a lie. Those work trips she had taken, they were vacations with him. She used my money to fund their adventures, while I stayed home, working, believing she was out building her career or spending time with her friends. One photo, in particular, broke me. It was a picture of her standing in front of a car dealership, holding up the keys to the brand new car she had bought David. The car was shiny, sleek, something I would never have bought for myself, let alone for anyone else. She had used my money to buy her lover a car. My mind reeled at the audacity of it, the sheer disrespect. I had been blind for so long. All those times I had questioned her behavior, all the moments when I thought something was off, she had managed to cover it all up with more lies, more distractions. I was left wondering how I could have been so stupid, so trusting. I had given her everything, and in return, she had taken it all and handed it to someone else. The last piece of the puzzle came from the private investigator. He had followed them again, this time to a hotel just outside of town. I received a call late one evening. "They're at it again," he said, his voice tense. "If you want to catch them in the act, now's your chance." I grabbed my car keys, my heart pounding in my chest. This was at the moment of truth. I wasn't sure what I was going to do when I got there, but I knew I had to see it for myself. When I arrived at the hotel, I spotted Melanie's car in the parking lot, parked next to David's. I felt a surge of anger, but I kept myself calm. I walked into the hotel, straight past the front desk, and up to the room number the investigator had given me. I stood outside the door, my hand shaking as I reached for the handle. For a moment, I hesitated. Part of me didn't want to know, didn't want to see it with my own eyes. But the other part of me, the part that had been betrayed, humiliated, needed this. I needed to see the lies unravel before me. I opened the door. There they were, wrapped in each other's arms, completely unaware of my presence. It was like watching a nightmare unfold in slow motion. They didn't notice me until it was too late. When they saw me standing there, their expressions shifted from shock to fear. For a moment, none of us said anything. The silence was deafening, the weight of the betrayal hanging in the air between us. Then, finally, Melanie spoke. "I can explain," she whispered, her voice trembling. But I didn't want an explanation anymore. The lies had unraveled, and there was nothing left to say. "I can explain," Melanie had said, but her words barely registered. I stood there, staring at them, frozen. My body felt detached from my mind, the scene unfolding before me like something out of a nightmare. There was nothing she could explain that would change what I'd seen, what I'd uncovered. The months of lies, the betrayal, the manipulation, it had all come crashing down, and there was no going back. David didn't say a word. He just sat there, looking at me with a mixture of fear and defiance, as if daring me to make the next move. I wanted to punch him, to let out all the rage that had been building inside me for so long, but I didn't. Somehow, I managed to stay in control, even though every fiber of my being was screaming for revenge. Instead, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving them behind without another word. My heart was pounding, my thoughts racing. It was over. Whatever remained of my marriage was beyond repair now. There was no more pretending, no more denying what was right in front of me. Melanie had made her choice, and it wasn't me. I drove home in a daze, my mind replaying everything I had discovered over the past few weeks. The lies, the stolen moments, the money she had spent on him, it all made me sick. How could she have done this? How could she have thrown away everything we had built together for someone like David, a man with a criminal past, a man who clearly cared nothing for me or the life I had given her? By the time I reached home, the anger had started to simmer. I couldn't keep it bottled up any longer. I grabbed the photos from the investigator and spread them out on the dining room table, evidence of her betrayal, the life she had been living behind my back. I stared at them, each one a dagger to the heart. The image of them together in the hotel, their hands intertwined, her face lit up with a happiness I hadn't seen in years, that was the final straw. I knew I couldn't go on like this. The weight of her deception had become too much to bear. I had to make a decision, and there was no turning back. I wasn't going to confront her again. What was the point? I had all the evidence I needed. There was no saving our marriage, and frankly, I didn't want to save it anymore. I called my lawyer the next morning. It was time to take action, to sever the ties that bound me to a woman who no longer cared about me. The divorce papers were drawn up quickly, and I made sure to include everything: the photos, the financial records, the proof of her infidelity. I wanted to make sure she couldn't contest it, couldn't walk away with more than she deserved. A week later, Melanie came home, unaware of what was waiting for her. I sat her down at the dining room table, where the photos still lay scattered, a silent reminder of everything she had destroyed. She looked at me, confused, maybe even a little scared. I slid the divorce papers across the table, my voice calm but firm. "It's over, Melanie," I said. "I know everything. I've seen everything. There's no point in dragging this out." For a moment, she just stared at the papers, her eyes wide, as if she hadn't truly believed it would come to this. Then, she slowly nodded, her expression a mixture of defeat and resignation. She didn't argue, didn't plead. She knew she had lost. I didn't ask her to explain, didn't ask for reasons or excuses. I didn't care anymore. The woman sitting in front of me was a stranger, someone I no longer recognized. The love I had once felt for her had been replaced by something cold and hard. It was strange, but in that moment, I didn't feel the anger I had expected. Instead, I felt relief that it was finally over. She signed the papers, her hands trembling slightly. As she handed them back to me, I looked at her one last time, searching for some hint of the woman I had fallen in love with all those years ago. But she was gone, replaced by someone I didn't know. I stood up, the weight of the past months lifting off my shoulders. "You can take whatever you need," I told her, my voice devoid of emotion. "But you need to be out of the house by the end of the week." She didn't argue. She just nodded, tears welling in her eyes, but I didn't feel sorry for her. Not anymore. That night, as I sat alone in the house that no longer felt like a home, I realized I had made the right choice. Melanie had betrayed me in every way possible, and while it hurt to admit, I was better off without her. The final straw had broken us, and there was no way to put the pieces back together. As I stared at the empty space where her things used to be, I felt a strange sense of peace. The storm had passed, and now, it was time to rebuild without her. The moment the private investigator told me where Melanie and David were meeting, I knew I had to see it for myself. Catching them red-handed was the only way I could finally close the door on this chapter of my life. I wasn't sure what I would do when I confronted them, but I knew I needed that moment, that undeniable proof, burned into my memory. It was the final piece of the puzzle, and I wasn't going to let it slip through my fingers. I drove to the hotel they had been using for months, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The anger simmered inside me, a slow boil that I could barely keep in check. As I pulled into the parking lot, I saw both of their cars parked side by side, like some sick display of their blatant disrespect. They didn't even bother hiding it anymore. I sat there for a moment, staring at the hotel's entrance, trying to steady my breath. My heart was racing, but my mind was clear. I had to do this. I had to face them. The investigator had told me the room number. It was all arranged. He had followed them up the elevator, had seen them enter the room together. This was it. I got out of the car, walking toward the hotel with a cold determination I hadn't felt before. No more guessing, no more waiting. When I reached the door of their room, I paused, my hand hovering over the handle. The room was quiet, no voices, no sounds. My heart thudded in my chest as I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. There they were, Melanie and David, caught. They were lying on the bed, wrapped in each other's arms, their expressions relaxed, as if the world outside didn't exist. But the moment they saw me, everything changed. Melanie gasped, her eyes wide with shock, and David sat up quickly, a look of pure panic spreading across his face. For a few seconds, we all just stared at each other, the weight of the situation sinking in. This was real. There was no more pretending, no more lies. They couldn't deny what they had done now, not with me standing there, seeing it with my own eyes. Melanie was the first to speak, her voice shaky and weak. "I can't explain," she stammered, trying to pull herself together, but it was too late. Her words meant nothing. I had seen everything I needed to see. "Explain?" I echoed, my voice low and controlled, despite the storm raging inside me. "There's nothing to explain, Melanie. I've known for months. I know everything." Her face drained of color as the full weight of her actions hit her. She glanced at David, but he was just as lost for words as she was. He didn't even try to defend himself. He sat there, his eyes darting around the room, looking for an escape, but there was none. He was trapped. I wanted to make him feel the pain that I had been carrying for so long. But then I realized something: he wasn't worth it. Neither of them were. Melanie had chosen him over me, and that was punishment enough. Instead, I smiled. It wasn't a smile of joy or triumph, but of finality. This was the end of the road for us. The person I had loved, the woman I had built my life with, was no longer mine. She had made her choice, and now she would have to live with it. "You're a coward," I said, my voice cold and steady, directed at David. "You didn't just take my wife. You took everything. My money, my time, my trust. And for what? For this?" David didn't respond. He just stared at me, his face pale, his mouth slightly open as if he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Melanie tried again. "Please, let's talk about this," she pleaded, her voice cracking with desperation. "It doesn't have to end like this." I shook my head, taking one last look at her, realizing how far apart we had grown. She wasn't the woman I thought she was. "It already ended, Melanie. You ended it the moment you chose him." The room was silent, the weight of the moment hanging in the air. I turned and walked out, leaving them behind. As I made my way down the hallway and out of the hotel, a strange sense of calm washed over me. I had done it. I had seen them for what they truly were: liars, cowards, people who had used me for their own selfish desires. By the time I reached my car, the anger had started to fade. I didn't feel defeated. In fact, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: freedom. The burden of their betrayal was no longer mine to carry. I had caught them red-handed, and now it was over. As I drove away, the image of them together faded from my mind. It was time to start over, without them. Driving away from the hotel that day, something inside me shifted. I wasn't weighed down by the betrayal anymore, but I wasn't ready to simply walk away and let Melanie and David carry on without consequences. They had wrecked my life, humiliated me, and used my hard work to fund their affair. I couldn't let them get away with it so easily. They deserved to feel the pain they'd caused me, and I was going to make sure they did. Revenge wasn't something that came naturally to me, but this time it felt justified. I didn't want to lash out in anger or violence. I wanted something more calculated, something that would hurt them where it mattered most. Melanie had taken everything from me, and now I was going to take everything from her. First, I started with the divorce. I had already filed the papers, but now I was determined to strip Melanie of as much as possible. I had all the evidence I needed: proof of her affair, photos of her and David together, records of her spending my money on him. My lawyer assured me that it was more than enough to secure a favorable settlement. Melanie wouldn't be walking away with anything she didn't deserve. While the legal wheels were turning, I started focusing on David. He wasn't just some bystander in all of this. He was a willing participant in the destruction of my marriage, and I had a plan to make sure he paid for it. I knew about his criminal past, and while he had managed to stay under the radar recently, I still had a few cards to play. Using the information the private investigator had gathered, I found out that David's finances were a mess. He had been relying on Melanie's money to keep himself afloat, but now that was about to change. I made a few anonymous calls to certain authorities, people who would be very interested in David's shady past and suspicious financial activities. It didn't take long before his world started to crumble. Within a few weeks, I heard through the grapevine that David's assets were being investigated. His bank accounts were frozen, and his business was under scrutiny. Without Melanie's money to support him, he was in trouble, and I couldn't help but feel a grim satisfaction knowing that his comfortable life was slipping away. He had built it on the back of my trust, and now it was all falling apart. But the real twist in my revenge came in the form of someone neither Melanie nor David had seen coming: Melanie's best friend, Lisa. She and I had known each other for years, ever since Melanie and I started dating, and we had always gotten along well. Lisa had been there for Melanie through thick and thin, and I suspected she knew about the affair long before I did. One evening, after everything had come to light, I ran into Lisa at a bar. She looked uncomfortable, as if she knew she'd been complicit in hiding Melanie's secrets. I bought her a drink, and we started talking about Melanie, about David, about everything. As the night wore on, something unexpected happened. Lisa admitted that she had always had feelings for me, feelings she had never acted on out of loyalty to Melanie. But now, things were different. It started innocently enough: a few drinks, a shared laugh, the understanding of two people who had been betrayed. But as the evening progressed, I realized that this was my chance to do what Melanie had done to me. Lisa was beautiful, smart, and in that moment, she was everything Melanie wasn't. It didn't take long before one thing led to another, and I found myself taking my revenge in a way I hadn't planned. The next morning, I woke up feeling strangely satisfied. It wasn't love, not by a long shot, but it was something. It was a reminder that I could move on, that I didn't have to be stuck in the shadow of Melanie's betrayal. And the fact that it was with her best friend? That was just the icing on the cake. I didn't go out of my way to tell Melanie what had happened with Lisa, but I didn't need to. Word travels fast in small social circles, and I knew it would reach her eventually. When it did, the look on her face was priceless. She had expected me to wallow in misery, to be devastated by her affair with David. Instead, she was the one left shocked and hurt, betrayed by someone she trusted. In the end, it wasn't just about the affair. It was about taking back control of my life, about showing Melanie and David that they hadn't broken me. They had thought they could manipulate me, use me, and discard me, but I wasn't the fool they thought I was. I had come out stronger, and they were left to deal with the consequences of their own choices. As the divorce was finalized and Melanie's world began to unravel, I walked away with my dignity intact. I had my revenge, but more importantly, I had my freedom. The life I had built with Melanie was gone, but I was free to start again without her, without David, and without the weight of betrayal hanging over me. The garden where their affair had begun was now empty, overgrown with weeds. It was a fitting symbol for what had happened. They had sown the seeds of deceit, and now they were left with nothing but ruin. As for me, I was ready to move forward, leaving the wreckage behind, and I knew that whatever came next, I would never be the same man again.